let me introduce our first three speakers who are going to talk about the state of the South China Sea today. And I fully recognize that they all got a surprise dropped on them yesterday with the new policy from the State Department. So this panel may have had to shift their talking points overnight, and I apologize. So first, we're just going to go in alphabetical order. We'll have Richard Heydarian. Richard is the resident political analyst at GMA Network, which is one of the largest broadcasters in the Philippines. His latest book is The Rise of Duterte, Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. Richard previously taught at De La Salle and Ateneo de Manila University in Manila and was a research fellow at National Chengchi University in Taiwan. Then we'll have Dr. Nong Hong. Nong is the executive director and a senior fellow with the Institute of China-America Studies in Washington. She's also a research fellow with the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in Hainan. And she was previously an ITLOS Nippon Fellow for International Dispute Settlement and a visiting fellow at the Center of Oceans Law and Policy at the University of Virginia and the Max Planck Institute. And then we'll close out with Dr. Wen Hong Son, who is the Director General and head of the Institute for the South China Sea at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Prior to this, he was the Deputy Director General of the Institute for Strategic Studies at DAV. Previous postings in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs included in Stockholm and in Ottawa, and with the ASEAN desk at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so without further ado, let me throw it to Richard Heydarian to start off our conversation. Richard.
Thank you very much. Great for that. Just a quick factual correction. My latest book is actually this one, The Indo-Pacific. And I'm just going to flash it because I don't have time to go through some of the discussions. First of all, I'm glad to be back again and to be the inaugural speaker of the inaugural series of the inaugural webinar on the South China Sea conference with the CSIS. So today what I'll try to discuss is micro, meso, and macro level discussion of the South China Sea. Let me first begin with the Philippines, the perspective of the Philippines, because much has been happening over the past few months. And of course, we have consistently written on that, so you can check my writings on that issue. Well, President Duterte has been consistently talking about his independent foreign policy. And somehow that meant less of US and more of China, or some would call it pivot to China. And critics have, tried to portray him as a Manchurian candidate or a Chinese governor in Manila. But I think what's even more interesting is independent from Duterte foreign policy. When you look at the statements that come out from top officials in the government, in fact, over the past year or so, if you look at the foreign secretary of the Philippines, his third foreign secretary, Teddy Boy Locsin, and the defense minister, Secretary Lorenzana, the Locsin-Lorenzana duo have been very consistent about their increasingly critical stance about what's happening in the South China Sea, which is remarkably different from what you tend to hear from President Duterte or previous foreign secretaries of the Philippines or other officials who are within the inner circle of the president. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind. And I think the other thing that we're also looking at right now is perhaps you could say that this is where we're seeing also the end of the potential honeymoon between the Philippines or President Duterte and China. I mean, over the past 4 years, President Duterte is already in his 5th year in office. China's promises of large-scale infrastructure investments, so far as I check, there are 0 Chinese infrastructure, big-ticket infrastructure investments in the Philippines. President Duterte was hoping to get major concessions from China in the South China Sea, particularly in the Scarborough Shoal, including hopes for getting some sort of a marine sanctuary and other sorts of concessions to allow for the Filipino fishermen to have easier access to the lagoon. But things have not been going well. And if you follow the news, last year, of course, during the Reed Bank crisis, you had a suspected Chinese militia ramming into a Filipino fishing vessel, and almost more than 22 individuals, Filipino, almost died, if not for the Vietnamese fishermen who happened to be illegally within our waters, but good enough they were able to save our folks. So I think what really has forced President Duterte's hand and has allowed for the more China skeptics element within the defense establishment and within the foreign ministry to more dictate what's happening in terms of Philippine foreign policy is clearly the Chinese brazenness in terms of its opportunism over the past few months. And you see this very explicitly reflected in the statements of no less than President Duterte himself in the recently concluded ASEAN summit, whereby he said, essentially, in the midst of this pandemic, we're still seeing these very disturbing developments. And of course, he was referring to, among other things, the February incident when a Chinese warship was suspected to point the radar gun at the Filipino warship. Not to mention, interestingly, the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs in April released an unprecedented solidarity statement with Vietnam when a Vietnamese fishing vessel was suspected to be sunk and 2 others apprehended by the Chinese Coast Guard vessels. That was unprecedented. If you just look at the tenor and cadence of the statement, I've never seen anything like that coming out of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And then over the next few weeks, you have Secretary Locsin tweeting, kind of like Trump, in the most provocative way possible, threatening China with the severest consequences if they threaten the Philippine interests in the area. So I think those are very interesting things to keep in mind, that instead of an independent foreign policy whereby we're moving away from the United States, you see more independent from Duterte's China-leaning rhetoric policy when it comes to Philippines' actual predisposition on the ground. And it's actually what's fascinating right now is, as everyone knows, in February, President Duterte made that unilateral decision, potentially unconstitutional because he didn't get the say of the Senate on this issue, to get rid of the visiting forces agreement. And the VFA with the US is extremely important because it's the software that allows for the hardware of our mutual defense treaty to apply, because it provides the legal framework for large-scale entry of American troops in and out. Now, President Duterte reversed that decision towards early June. And obviously, you cannot separate that from what's happening there in the South China Sea. So over the next days, you saw the Philippine ambassador to the United States, you saw Secretary Locsin, you saw many top officials in the Philippines making it very clear that the developments in the South China Sea were a major driver of that decision. Up until today, it's already July, middle of July, I've not heard from President any major statement on that issue. So that's something very interesting, because that decision was supposed to be upon the president's instruction. So we're not really it's hard to understand what's going on, but it's most likely a situation where the president's hands were forced by elements within the government who are saying, we cannot this is the worst time to initiate a strategic divorce with America, just when we're facing these kinds of unprecedented crisis and threats also in the South China Sea. And that brings me to the second issue. You see, of course, there's been a lot of criticism of President Trump and the Trump administration on so many levels. But I think the fact of the matter is that many people have underestimated how there has been an improvement in terms of American commitment to its allies, especially on the South China Sea question over the past few years under the Trump administration. We see that, over the past 6 months, the US has conducted more FONOPs than 3 or 4 years under the Obama administration. And Greg and we have been all arguing that, of course, FONOPs alone is not enough, but it's necessary as part of a bigger package of constraining China's worst instincts. We have also seen that foreign military financing to the Philippines actually doubled under the Trump administration. But I think most importantly, and this is where the Pompeo statement didn't come as complete shock to us, we don't see it as a kind of a cynical ploy during an election when Trump wants to look good by bashing China. We see it as a very much logical progression in terms of the increasingly tough stance of US in the South China Sea. And I think from the Philippine perspective, what really caught our attention was last year during March, during a press conference that Secretary Pompeo made in Manila, and he made a detour from the visit in Vietnam during the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. He made it very clear, and this is the first time. I didn't see this in the documents during the Carter or Clinton administration, but definitely not during the Obama administration and Bush administration. He made it very clear that the Mutual Defense Treaty will not just apply in the vague sense of the Pacific waters, but in the South China Sea. And he, and later on Ambassador Sun Kim to the Philippines, also made it very clear that the Mutual Defense Treaty will be applicable and activated potentially if the Philippines' aircraft, vessels, and soldiers in the South China Sea, in the disputed areas, come under attack by a third party. That was the most explicit expression of commitment we have seen from America since, the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed, or at least since the South China Sea disputes have become so heightened. So I think that was a huge ramp up in American commitment. That's why I really paid attention to the Pompeo statement. And what really caught my attention was, it was not so much the rejection of China's claims, which is nothing new. I think ASEC Stilwell was correct on that. But it's like how it implies that the US is effectively supporting the Philippines' claim, for instance, to the Mischief Reef and Second Thomas Shoal as an extension of the Philippine continental shelf, right? So definitely for me, I mean, if you really push it, it seems that statement will have certain operational implications, particularly in terms of what are going to be the contingency plans in terms of the application of the Mutual Defense Treaty if China engages in any provocative action, whether reclamation in the Scarborough Shoal as part of creating the sprawling network to effectuate an ADIZ, or ejecting the Filipino troops aggressively from the Second Thomas Shoal or other land features in the strategies that we control. So I was not surprised that Secretary Lorenzana actually released a statement in support of the Pompeo statement just a few hours ago, and it was very positively and very supportive. So I think the Philippine Armed Forces is also carefully looking at what are going to be the operational implications of this with the question of the MDT. And on the last issue, on the issue of ASEAN, I mean, kudos to Vietnam that despite all of the constraints that we are facing right now, I mean, it's really hard to have informal, you know, buddy talk over Zoom or webinar, not to mention their concerns about privacy and everything like that. But if you look at the statement that came out of ASEAN, the latest ASEAN statement on the South China Sea issue, I think this is the first time where we see that the ASEAN made it very clear that only UNCLOS will be the sole legal basis for the resolution and management of the disputes. And this definitely will spill over into the modalities for the negotiation of the Code of Conduct. Because you see, when it comes to Code of Conduct, there's so much vagueness about it that I think no one in his right mind believes that this will be finished by next year, or even last year we would have thought that it will be finished by next year. But I think now at least the ASEAN has made its part very clear that if there's going to be any legally binding nature to the COC, if we're going to talk about any legal reference, it's going to be UNCLOS. And increasingly, if you look at the statements and nota verbale of Indonesia to the United Nations, if you look at now Vietnam even threatening arbitration against China, even from some statements from Malaysia, particularly their extended continental shelf submission last December, it seems finally we're seeing the ASEAN doing, or at least key members within the ASEAN doing what they were supposed to do back in 2016. So I got to know Ambassador Stilwell when I read his statement about praising how Vietnam is so brave and standing up, you know, to China and all of that. But hello, like the Philippines was the one who initiated this arbitration. And actually we were completely isolated back in the days. Greg knows it. We were not getting much love from ASEAN, not even probably from the Obama administration. Now it's good that Vietnam and others are speaking out. And I think we need more of that. And we need to go beyond ASEAN. I think the ASEAN Plus is really a mini-lateral approach whereby you have key countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam getting their act together. And probably instead of wasting our time on Code of Conduct, which is not going anywhere with China, I doubt it will go anywhere. Let's look at settling our boundaries based on the UNCLOS, based on the Philippine Arbitration Award, or perhaps even negotiating our own form of COC. And that will also spill over into broader discussions about Quad. You know, Quad, it seems to be alive and kicking, but it cannot just be a counter alliance against China. It should be also about helping certain key countries within the ASEAN to develop the requisite capabilities to stand their ground and defend their legitimate interests. So I'll keep it there before I say more controversial things. Sorry, it's been a long 13, 14 hours today, thanks to Secretary Pompeo's statement. So I'll keep it there. Thank you very much. Great.
Thanks, Richard.